I'll talk about frigid weather and sediment transport and morphology. And basically, with frigid weather, you cross the border from liquid water to solid water, ice, and ice contributes more variability to sediment transport and to morphology. There are some characteristics of channels that have ice and their morphological characteristics, but it adds variability. Things change. It adds noise to sediment transport and to morphology. It makes analysis more complicated. Frigid weather brings ice, and we are near the lower end of frigid weather in the northern hemisphere. And water is a hot material. It's close to its solidification point, freezing point. Ice in rivers is like a buoyant rock, is like an igneous rock. Igneous rocks form from their melt. Ice and glaciers are more a metamorphic rock. You have precipitation as you head in sedimentary rocks, and then they metamorphose through pressure and temperature change. So ice is a buoyant rock, and the movement of ice in rivers is a bit like some of the examples that Pierre gave with regard to, I would say, mud flows. Ice is very important from southern Colorado up into North Pole. Ice provides a mechanism for sediment transport, particularly coarse material, sometimes for, and I'll show some examples, for finer materials, sands. You may not realize it, but a lot of the ice forms on the bed of the river first, rather than on the top of a river or a lake, because the water gets supercooled and turbulence mixes it down below, and then it gets seeded through snow crystals or crystals dropping off trees. It's very sticky and grows on particles and decreases the particle mass or weight. And those particles become buoyant or ice rafted and get conveyed. So as I'll show in video, the ice can convey quite large particles, cobbles. This often happens in the early hours, so people are not there to monitor or measure. These are views from the Laramie River, which is an ideal, wadeable, small outdoor lab of a river. When the sun comes out, it's sunny weather here, you get a lot of insulation, a lot of heat. And thermal fluxes, I point out, are very important in sediment transport. I've seen rivers around here which don't freeze in wintertime. And you go from here to there, and the river over there is frozen because of groundwater seepage and so forth. Ice provides a mechanism for sediment transport. You look at length scales. Let's look at the micro scale. We'll go through hydraulic structure scale, next scale up until global scale. And so for rivers, we're right smack bang in the phase diagram of water, at least a section of it, the pressure temperature phase diagram of water. So in this part of the country, we move over the freezing curve, and ice is a very unique material. The solid phase of water is more buoyant than the liquid phase, and that's because this line has a negative slope, which no other material has. And you can show through the Clausius-Clapeyron equation, if you have a negative slope there, the solid phase is more buoyant than the liquid phase. So ice is more buoyant. Just imagine the planet if ice was heavier, like most other materials, solid phase was heavier than the liquid phase. So ice would drop to the bottom. Ice does form on the bottom, but because it's supercooled water, those of you wearing glasses are looking at this screen through a supercooled liquid glass. Glass is not a solid, it's a liquid. It's a supercooled liquid. But we are, in terms of the planet Earth, this time of year, we're close to the freezing temperature. This is density, temperature. Water is densest at 4 degrees, thanks to the molecular structure of water. And if there's no seed, we get supercooling, which is always amazes me that you have these very delicate processes, because the supercooling is about less than 1/10 of a degree, it can be a couple hundredths of a degree more. No seed is provided. It's a very clear night. You get supercooled water. Very delicate, but very ubiquitous. It happens a lot around in the Rockies and north of this in the global scale. It affects the sediment transport. This is the pressure, temperature, volume diagram of water, which is PTV diagrams of all materials. So water is a material. It has material behavior, not just a fluid, not just a medium to deal with, or not just a commodity that you manage and provide irrigators for ecological development. It's a material. It's a hot material, and we live this time of year close to the material's solidification point. So if I look at the globe, the shaded area, much of the northern hemisphere, are locations where at least 1 month of the per annum average surface temperature is less than 0 degrees centigrade, so below the freezing temperature. So solidification is an important factor. So if you're dealing with rivers through here, you have to deal with ice. And ice, in my opinion, does contribute something to the morphology of the channel, particularly the biology, the plant growth of the channel, but it contributes primarily noise. to armor layers, sediment transport, to morphology, which makes it very hard to apply numerical models because they get, in this part of the world, there are other factors at play which these numerical models don't play and have to deal with. The zone is deepest in mountainous areas. The next figure is from the Army Corps of Engineers, the Cold Regions Lab, between and the B line. I'll define them soon, but they relate to the number of months or the period with which the temperature is less than 0 degrees. So we're in Colorado, we're about here. If you're above the A line, you know that water solidifies, ice formation is typical, so you deal with it. The difficulty if you're in Colorado or New Mexico or Nebraska, ice forms infrequently to cause problems. And that itself is a problem for designers. They tend to treat ice, they treat sediment for that matter, as a nuisance. Ice is a dangerous nuisance, causes problems. This figure here, again from earlier source from the Army Corps of Engineers, is the A and B lines projected over the northern hemisphere, where the lines are thickest, between the distance between the A and the B line, like through the North America, where you have mountainous areas, higher elevation. And so we here in Colorado we're part of the Northern Great Plains, which is one of the most dynamic locations, weather-wise, climate-wise, on the planet. The weather changes very dramatically here. So we have these fluctuations. And so many hydraulic structures, bridges and dams and spillways fail because they don't take these fluctuations into account. So we are between the A and the B line. A concern, and what we'll see here in Colorado, with climate warming, we'll see more. The B line will move up, A line will move up, and we'll get more of the type of problems with ice that occur at lesser frequency, which means the designers get lulled into thinking that ice is not a problem. It's a nuisance, but not as dangerous as you think. I'll show you what happens when designers forget what ice can do. The figure here gives some definition of the A line and the B line. In cold regions engineering, an area that I got into when I went to Iowa in the first year, and then I found I really liked the area because things naturally really happen when water changes from liquid to solid. But between the A and the B line, a good study has to be done in terms of frequency. As you go from the A and the B, less frequent problems, the problems are, in fact, practical ways more severe because the designers get lulled into thinking that ice is not a problem. Ice is a problem. Ice is a process. Some work has been done already to handle ice. This is a dam on the Mississippi River, like a Dam 14 between Iowa and Illinois. And you have radial gates and underflow gates and overflow gates. They've added overflow gates, drum gates, to handle the ice. So more recent upgrades of structures and so forth are better designed or equipped to handle ice, but ice is still a problem. At the molecular scale, we had the characteristics of water depending very much on pressure and temperature. Temperature is global effect. The effect of latitude and maybe altitude too affects the temperature of which you are as a water molecule. Pressure effects are more felt in hydraulic structures like this in the Sierra Nevadas, where I was involved with, where you had a inverted siphon which dropped water through a valley here and then raised it up there. So as you increase the pressure, remember the freezing curve is a negative slope, you change the freezing temperature. So ice melts as pressure increases. Water solidifies as pressure decreases. So if I'd shown ice on here, fragile ice or snow, it all melts. As it rises up here, you get slush ice or fragile ice forming, which the siphon would frequently block. This happened at this siphon, also happened in the siphon in Nebraska. Pressure on the phase diagram is affected by the design of the hydraulic structure, rather than the global presentation figure affects more the temperature. So this is what happens when designers forget the water solidifies. This is the Niobrara River in the northern part of Nebraska, not too far from here. In this part of the world, we are subject to bomb cyclones, where the cold front comes from down from the north. It travels fast. The cold fronts travel faster than warm fronts, wraps around the warm front. So preceding this, we had a cold winter. We had a lot of snow, a lot of ice. Then we had a warm spell, which dropped rain and things got warmer. Then it got cold as the cold air wrapped around it in cyclonic motion. And these things happen very fast. The word blizzard is an invention of the northern plains area. Fast-moving, windy, cold events. It may not be the peak flood that's experienced, but it was the combination of cold, fast-moving, cyclone, the cold, followed by warm, followed again by cold, blew out. This is the Spencer Dam on the Niobrara River, which is well known for sediment transport, contributing to the Missouri. We have equivalent to debris flows not too far from here, where large chunks of a pickup truck of ice can knock out through the powerhouse, knock out gates through here, knock out bridges. I haven't included this presentation, but the bridge upstream was just lifted completely off its support, transported a mile downstream and just dropped on the stream bed intact. Here, they built the bridge a little bit more stoutly, but the bottom stringer they had to straighten out. It buckled because of ice uplift pressure that can occur. So ice can exert large pressures. So you have these cut noses, which are meant to cause ice to fail in flexion, right up, and ice is weaker in flexion, like most materials really, compared to compression, but it's totally useless with regard to ice uplift. I have another set of photographs which show the bridge upstream of this, which was lifted up its foundation and dumped. These bridges become sites where the ice accumulates and scour occurs beneath the accumulated ice, and that pressure then releases, and then you get a dynamic flow of ice and water surging down to the next bridge, which then holds up, builds up, backs up water, builds up ice, scours the bed, and then rushes down and blows out the dam, which I showed here. This is on the morning after. I should add that braided channels are problem channels for ice conditions. They're shallow, and they can quickly grow a lot of ice. Because they're shallow, they have less heat reserve in them. So they grow a lot of ice very fast. They're a problem for hydraulic structures, like bridges or dams. On braided channels are always a problem. This is an older dam. They have radial gates, totally inadequate for this situation. And I think when you have ice-prone rivers, you need to develop or design the gates to be much more responsive than this particular dam. It occurs at night, occurs in the dark, occurs in the cold, and a lot of the gates are hard to open. Around here, we have ice runs like mud flows, which happen routinely. A lot of the rivers near Mika, near I-70. And this shows you the typical ice run that we find that causes wintertime flooding. It's very common. So here's an ice run. We have weather like we've had this week, cold and then warm. We let it melt. Warm. So this is ice run. The video taken from a bridge occurs here on the Roaring Fork River and other rivers. Classic river in this state is the Gunnison River, downstream of Gunnison Dam. You have large ice pieces. So this is would you call it a mud flood? I'm not sure. Kind of different again, perhaps, but just to say these sorts of events, like the event I showed with Spencer Dam, are actually very common here. This is a bridge. And, yes, there's a warm up there. The water increases, it lifts the ice cover. The ice cover breaks up in dynamic mode and then is rushed down shore. So this is and if you happen to have a dam or a bridge that's badly designed, you can knock it out. This happens routinely. So ice flooding in the Rockies is very common. This phenomenon is very common.
So is this from a rainstorm or reservoir?
Just warm weather, warming up. So thermodynamics are very important for for ice and for sediment transport too, and for biology streams, in terms of where fish tend to hang out and so forth. But you can see the amount of solids that's right. So this is like buoyant rock moving down, but not quite as hard as rock. If the ice forms, it adds resistance, so the flow level increases. And so if you add more water to the mix, you form what's called, and I'll show later, a jave, a jam wave. It's kind of like a surge, mud flood surge. Ice is an important mechanism for moving sediment, bed sediment. And so we have, this is a diagram that many textbooks need to update, but we have seed crystals, so you have supercooled water and fragile ice sticking on the bottom, sticking on gravel in particular, but also sand. And then you have insulation. The addition of heat from the sun makes the bond weak, and then you buoyancy, because the slush, it pans to float to the surface, they drift downstream and they accumulate. So it's a typical accumulation cover, which we form here. And with the ice, you move sediment. So it adds uncertainty to estimates of bed load. So this is the Laramie River early morning, typical early morning. You have ice on the bed of the river. So ice is a major player in terms of sediment movement. So this, you get all various forms depending on how cold it is and how long. But typically in the morning when it's still dark, you don't have insulation from the sun. And by about 9 o'clock or 10 o'clock, these will disbond and lift up and drift downstream. A few more. This is the Platte River in Nebraska. Anchor ice. This is a braided channel by and large. Shallow anchor ice. Doesn't take much heat loss to form, for the water to become supercooled. You add a seed crystal, and then you get secondary nucleation. The ice crystals collide, and you get more created. They bond. Ice, water which is supercooled, is very sticky. And ice in supercooled water is very sticky. It sticks to everything. Trash racks, which I'll show soon, and sediment transport. So becomes a major mover of sediment at low flow conditions. But the conditions typically, you have ice, border ice growing from the banks. But for a broad channel like this, the water in the channel gets supercooled and bonds quickly to the material on the bed. So if you do a sediment transport analysis of the Platte River, and you don't include the effect of ice, you include inaccuracy, which may be within the inaccuracy anyway of what you do. This is ice on Flat Creek in Wyoming. You can see the anchor ice, fairly shallow flows going here. So this is early in the morning. And so that'll lift up, and then it lifts off the bed, rips off the Yama layer and any sediment that can occur at the surface. In deeper rivers too, which we don't normally see, anchor ice forms. This is in Alaska. Anchor ice is here on the bed. This is a hydraulic lead. You can see water steam, water smoke, basically water evaporating here. And fish are attracted to this. I've seen this on the Missouri River and so forth because of open water, light and oxygenation and so forth. I can show you a couple of videos. This is on the Laramie. These videos are on the Laramie River. No, this is another. These are views of anchor ice with an underwater camera ripping off the armor layer on the bed. These are videos just showing the gravel conveyed by ice. Ice rafting is a major mechanism in downstream. This is another video which shows anchor ice near the bed of a sandbed river, the Laramie River again, sand, gravel bed, ripping off the armor layer. And the next video shows anchor ice drifting downstream. Beneath here, drifting along downstream is a cobble this size. You'll see a hand reach in and grab the cobble, which we put marked bed material on the bed. So ice rafting is a major mechanism of larger particle movement in wintertime in this part of the world. So cobbles, which you don't have enough open water oomph to move them along, can be rafted, included in anchor ice. They move distances, as I'll show soon, the same as when you have peak flood flows. Also, if you have fine material like dunes, ice can collect in the wake of a dune, and then the dune moves over the ice, and the ice gets included in the dune. So you have a dune frozen in place. This is important in looking at sandbed rivers and how they behave in wintertime. We did an experiment in the Laramie River. We put in a grid like an intake structure and looked at anchor ice growth on the grid bars, and it completely blocked it in a very short time. And we had an underwater camera, so you can see the anchor ice which would form on sediment also forms on bars. So anchor ice formation or ice blockage of water intakes is anchor ice formation. If you read early accounts by Russians or Canadians, they talk of anchor ice blocking of water intakes to Montreal, to St. Petersburg at the time. Then when the sun comes up, it all melts off. This is captured, and we have the details in terms of ice concentration and so forth at the time. So ice is very important for rafting sediment, and including sediment in ice covers, which reinforce ice covers. You can imagine concrete, which has got aggregates added into it. So ice is very important for rafting material. So if you go in the Missouri River and you drill through the ice cover, this is what you see, sand included in the ice cover. So it makes the ice cover stronger, and it's a mechanism for sediment movement in wintertime. And so we did another study on the Laramie River, which I'll describe soon, but many bridges, the clearance between the water surface when you have ice present, which affects the stage, are not designed for ice presence. This is a view of a bridge on the Iowa River in Iowa. This is just a general sketch. And in my opinion, most bridges in Nebraska road bridges are designed too low. Rail bridges are higher. So we did a field experiment on the Laramie River. We compared ice rafted sediment with water transported sediment to determine how important, for the Laramie River at least, ice rafting was. And so we had a site like this, small river like the Laramie River is an ideal. These small rivers are wadable. They're good outdoor labs. This is the reach and indication of the zones. And we compared rafting of ice with open water condition. We used methods which are indicated here, everything from wading, bedload samplers to eyes, just visual observation of what was happening. We measured the distances traveled by ice rafted sediment, the frequency of ice rafting events, and we viewed the ice rafted material, and we did a sieve analysis of anchor ice rafted sediment. Travel distances were comparable to those that open water would convey sediment, particularly the coarser sediments. Tracked cobbles conveyed more than a kilometre, and on average, the events occur about move gravel and cobbles and so forth, about 10 to 100 metres per event. The frequency of events, on average, the study showed that 14 anchor rafting of ice events occurred every fall, 16 in the spring, 30 events total per year. Anchor ice coverage varied from a few patches. So if you go to many rivers around here, you'll see, even shallow rivers, you'll see anchor ice formation. Again, a very delicate formation. The water gets super cold, only a fraction of a degree, but it occurs over and over again. So if you go to the North Park, you'll find shallow rivers where you'll see anchor ice formation. If the river is too shallow, you won't get rafting because it can't lift high enough. The amount of ice formed depends on the thermal fluxes, and those are very important in this part of the country. So we also viewed various events. This is a photograph of sand included in the anchor ice. The anchor ice disbonds, which happens on a typical sunny day, early morning, mid-morning. It conveys sediment, and it gets included in the accumulation cover, ice cover that occurs on rivers. This is a sieve analysis diagram. So typical ice rafting are the coarser sizes of bed sediment. So coarser material is easier to raft than finer material by and large. So with the study we did, the ice rafting was coarser side up to this size for the particular samples that we did. So rafted ice conveyed particularly the coarser sediment. So ice rafting is a major mechanism for moving the coarser fractions of sediment in rivers between lines B and A. You don't see them because it happens early in the morning when it can be still dark. In bigger rivers, it's hard to get out to. In terms of concentrations, some numbers are given here, some details with regard to the size of the particles moved. This is not new. This has been known for 100 years at least. In Russia, in Canada, and other parts of the northern hemisphere. Anchor ice rafting of sediment, as you see here, is a major mover of these coarser particles, and it depends very much on the thermal fluxes. With regard to morphology, what does ice do to channel morphology? I have a list of things here. Ice adds to the unsteadiness of channel morphology. You can see in the vegetation channels that have ice effects, but typically the channels shift much more with ice. I've seen that in Alaska, on the Missouri River, rivers around here, and ice has a big effect, so say, on ecology. So if we come to thermal fluxes, I won't go through each of these in great detail, but around here, this figure here shows the thermal fluxes, which are defined over here, and the size of the channel. And in mountainous areas, you have the mountains to contend with. And so we're looking at channels around here. The mountains can block out the sun, the heat insulation, so the anchor ice can last more than one day, typically. Or if you have a lot of groundwater coming in from rocky mountainous areas, there are channels that stay open. I've seen channels around Leadville, for instance, that stay open. And the other side of the valley, same size channel, freezes over quickly. It's because of the groundwater flow. But you have these fluxes which you need to take into account. So thermodynamics are very important in terms of ice formation, in terms of the molecular behavior of water. Water is a material, and therefore ice effects on sediment transport. So in terms of morphology, the resistance coefficient varies a lot with in terms of glassy ice like F. Channel size, as I indicated in the sketches here, you can get a sense of how the resistance to channel flow changes when an ice cover forms. Also in this figure here, T is the ice cover thickness, Y is the water depth here, and you can look at the scale here, and ice dominates, water dominates here. Now, if you put a hydropower facility, such as Fort Peck Dam, on the Fort Peck reach of the Missouri River, you'll affect the stability of that channel, basically running through central Montana right through to North Dakota, because in wintertime it conveys more flow than under nature would tend to do. So one can go into all sorts of analyses like this. So if you add hydropower, you push it down here, so flow will dominate, and I'll show the effects of that. You have an ice cover on a channel. The bed load methods that are typically developed still apply, but you need to get the velocity profile, the shear stress right. The velocity, the flow depth increases, the shear stress on the bed decreases accordingly. Keep the slope the same, you increase the resistance to flow, but the same bed material methods that apply to open water also apply for ice cover, as long as you get the resistance correct. For ice, you can get these runs, which I showed in the video, and these where you can get a dynamic ice break up of the ice cover that affects anything like a bridge down here or a dam. Fortunately, in this country, most of the rivers flow to the south, so that the rivers tend to melt out in their headwaters. As they go south, they encounter less ice. If you go in Siberia, many of the big rivers like the Yenisei or the Ob flow north, so they have major problems on those rivers where the rivers melt out or break up first on their upstream end and run into ice on their downstream end. And so major effects that they have, which you don't hear much about, but major problems. This is an ice run on the Lead River, and the term J that's used in ice hydraulic jam, located wave, basically, and it tears down and rips through the cover. And if you have a bridge or a dam downstream, it can be problematic. This shows you the morphology, typically of a river that you have dynamic ice runs. You don't find much shrubs or larger vegetation close to the river because it gets destroyed. And in ice hydraulics, we can often see on trees how high the water level got because of ice impacting the trees, tree trunk and so forth, ice scarring and so forth, which I don't include in any photographs here. You look at ice jams, frequency of ice jams, this figure here gives you a sense. And so we're in Colorado. We're kind of, I can't quite reach it, but the middle of Colorado. Ice jams are an important feature of this particular part of the world, and particularly weather fluctuations have major roles. You don't get a freeze up and then it occurs, stays frozen. You get multiple freeze ups each year, which cause sediment frequently to be rafted. move down. So you can get accumulations like this. Very quickly you can get scour formed underneath. So if you have a bridge here which accumulates and stops the sediment, scour develops, and then that'll flush on down. So bridges act like barriers for ice runs. They create surges like this one in Iowa. If you go to the Yellowstone, you look at remnants of ice runs. This is a freeze-up jam, which occurs when the weather starts to get cold, finer grain material. It's a railway track and the flow is forced over here. So morphologically, these accumulations affect the morphology, but they don't change the morphology per se, other than the vegetation, but they add to the noise, the frequency of adjustments that occur. This is a case where the Yellowstone River in Montana comes close to a railway line, and you have a jam, freeze-up jam, which is a problem in mountainous areas, changing the flow direction. Then it'll melt out, and the channel will be this way. The difficulty is that what causes the unsteadiness is where the flow is greatest, as I'll show soon, ice tends to accumulate. So then it blocks off that region, and this channel over this side will open up because there's less resistance. The ice is not here. For a small river like the Laramie River, or the figure up there from the Missouri River, the Fort Peck Reach, with the Kroll Regions Lab people. This is the Laramie River, and the river used to go through here. This got clogged with ice, so the resistance increases, so the flow finds a path of least resistance, goes through here, and this is the main channel for a while. Then this channel will clog next winter, and then this becomes the main channel, so that you have the variability. Problem with on the Fort Peck Reach with farmers, ranchers, and they use irrigation water, have small floating intakes. They used to irrigate sugar beets and provide water for cattle. The groundwater was too saline to use there. And the farmer on this side would be happy for a while, and the farmer over had his intake over there would not be happy because much less flow went through there. But next year, this farmer would not be happy because this blocked, and then he would be happy because, or he or she would be happy because that blocked. So it adds the flip-flopping, particularly of sinuous braided channel morphology. This shows you in the Susitna River, an example, sequence of days here, series of aerial photographs. Main channel can get plugged, and the flow is forced to flow through a slough, and that becomes the main channel for a while until next season that will plug, and then the flow will go back over here. So that variability, which has not been studied, so I can't say that for 5 years that will remain the main channel, but you'll get a sense of the ice becomes a interferer, a nuisance in a way, or a factor, put it that way. So we have bends, which are prime locations for jams to form. So if the jam goes through a bend, this is on the Missouri River, Fort Peck Reach, we have a tight meander bend. Jam forms here very readily, and the flow will cut through. You get a cutoff through here. This is a tight bend. If you have a wider bend, it's also on the Fort Peck Reach, all the way back here, and then flow went across here, and it dropped sediment and so forth. So this reinforced this net. Not enough has been studied to say conclusively anything about this, but just to show that ice is a mechanism for affecting channel morphology in various ways. Ice and bends. If this was a free surface flow, we know we have a spiral, a circulation, and the flow goes around a bend. If you have an ice cover, that circulation is broken in two parts and much weaker, and that affects the bend behavior and performance. If you have a sinuous braided channel in open water conditions, the flow may be like this. With an ice cover, it tends to focus the flow like this. The ice affects the morphology in that respect. And to my mind, it adds uncertainty and noise. If you have a series of bends like this, ice will tend to concentrate water where it's deepest. You might get more bank erosion, as illustrated here. You have rafted ice with riffles. The rafting may be disrupted by the turbulence as the flow goes over the riffles, particularly on rivers like the Big Thompson or the Poudre River, for instance. And so the riffles will actually build up because of ice, because ice drops the cobbles and the gravel on those riffles. The riffles get bigger with time. You have something called alphice, or in Russian it's called nayet, which is water flows like a thin film over ice and freezes very hard. Alphice is very tough ice. So you have braided channels, shallow channels, they tend to form alphice. If you go up the Poudre River, you'll find a combination of border ice growing off protruding cobbles, then the flow being forced over, you get alphice, ice growing on ice. And it's very tough. This is in the Siberian River. You get alphice through here. You can see the layers, very hard ice. In Alaska, they get on some of the braided rivers, they get thick accumulations of, this is an early photograph by this report from the Corps of Engineers, showing up to 5 meters thick. And these last year round. Culverts are a problem. Drainage is a problem. Culverts freeze up. So if you go by Cameron Pass at the top of Poudre Valley, you'll find a culvert. It has the Michigan ditch coming in, feeding water into the Poudre River. That culvert is a problem. Tried to form ice cover and limit the amount of flow going through it. You have water flowing on top of ice here. This is another creek in Alaska. A lot of this remains to be investigated or studied. It's not easy to investigate. People don't like going out in the cold and winter time, particularly in the dark. You need special facilities to do this in a lab. You need a cold lab to form these. And so if you have an ice cover, as I've shown before, the cover tends to rip out any vegetation. So this is a view of the Missouri River, the Fort Peck Reach in Montana, where the ice cover was in here, when the ice cover took out all the vegetation here. You can tell ice channels that have major ice formation, the vegetation is relatively. Well, the Russians had a word for that, Veshevnik, which is very useful for rivers like the Ob or Yenisei, where ice would remove all the vegetation. So if you had to haul barges upstream, particularly in the early days with horses or by manpower, these were convenient pathways that you could pull a barge upstream. They were called Veshevniks. So I would look for the vegetation changes that occur in a channel. So vegetation changes are greater than morphological changes. They add unsteadiness and noisiness to the system. So I'll finish the presentation by saying overall ice adds erosion mechanisms, seasonally affects the quantities and rates of sediment transport, especially the coarser sediment, coarser cobbles, which are hard to move except the extreme peak flows, liquid water, are readily moved by ice. They get rafted up, included in the ice cover. They get moved down substantial distances, the same as they would get moved in open water conditions. They add noise to the morphology. They imprint. You can't say that that channel was distinctly, that's an ice channel. So you showed in Alaska meandering. Ice is another mechanism that can cause cutoffs or reinforcement of meander bends. When you have ice covers formed, you can get localized scars, such as under bridges, which tend to accumulate ice. You can get infilling of a bed. You can get switching of the main thalweg of the bed, increasing of interbranching and avulsion. You'll see this more frequently occurring on channels that have ice. Thermal scales, which I have not gone into, but are very important in the Rockies. For example, Flat Creek in Wyoming, which is Flat Creek. The site that we surveyed was looked at for some number of years, was in Jackson, Wyoming. And you have the ski field, the Snow King. The mountain blocks between late December through January, blocks the sun, blocks insolation. So you get a lot of freeze up and unfortunately very expensive properties along the Flat Creek there. So they get a lot of winter flooding. So they have to park a couple of backhoes along the channel to physically remove ice to allow the water to move through. So thermal effects are very important. I haven't gone into that at all in this particular talk. River ice effects, particularly biota. So if I know a river that's going to stay free of ice, particularly downstream, immediately downstream of a dam, I know that's good trout fishing there. But I've seen streams around in the Rockies which get groundwater flow, excellent trout fishing. Geotechnical effects are important too, and I haven't gone into those very much either, because ice affects the strength of soils. And I pointed out in the last lecture that the abutment approach, which is an earth fill approach, to the rigid part, which is the bridge deck, and the portion between the abutment column and the embankment is naturally a weak zone because you get freeze-thaw effects occurring. It's very hard to get compaction machinery in there to compact soil. So that naturally is a weak zone in the bridge. Most bridges fail there. You showed bridges in Japan and Korea on major rivers. They don't have the abutments at all protruding into the channels. They want to keep the channels as clear as possible. So you don't find abutments on the major channels, for example, in Japan, on the main rivers, the rivers that the Tone River through Tokyo, for instance. Anyway, a lot more work to be done, which is good news for us, I think. And I'll end my talk on that point.